On the afternoon of September 19, 1944, Hauptmann Rudolf Köhler stood at the railing of a converted Liberty ship and watched the coast of Virginia materialize through the Atlantic haze. Köhler had been captured 6 weeks earlier outside Falaise, pulled from a drainage ditch where he had hidden for 3 days after his regiment disintegrated under American artillery. He was 34 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, and 3 years on the Eastern Front. He had commanded a company of the 352nd Infantry Division, the same division that had defended Omaha Beach, the same division that had been ground to splinters in Normandy. Of the 180 men he had led into combat on June 6th, 11 had survived to surrender alongside him. He had seen war. He understood attrition. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had watched armies bleed, that the Americans must be nearing exhaustion. The mathematics demanded it. The invasion had cost them dearly. Everyone said so. The bocage had been a slaughterhouse. The breakout had stretched their lines. Soon, Köhler believed the American offensive would culminate, and the war would settle into the stalemate that Germany needed to negotiate a survivable peace. Then the ship rounded Cape Henry, and Rudolf Köhler saw Norfolk Naval Base. He stopped breathing. Ships. More ships than he had seen in his entire life. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, row upon row of gray steel stretching to the horizon, anchored in clusters so dense they seemed to form artificial islands. Cranes swung through the air. Welding torches flickered. The skeleton of a ship he could not identify rose from a dry dock, its ribs exposed like a cathedral under construction. "Mein Gott!" whispered Oberleutnant Erich Pfeiffer beside him. Pfeiffer had been captured the same day, a platoon commander from Köhler's own battalion. His voice cracked on the words. "Mein Gott, how many do they have?" But it was not the ships that broke something inside Rudolf Köhler. It was the men. Sailors moved across the docks in streams, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands, flowing between the ships and the warehouses and the barracks with the unhurried efficiency of men who had never known shortage. They wore clean uniforms. They laughed. Some of them were eating as they walked. Sandwiches, fruit, items wrapped in paper that Köhler could not identify. A group of 6 sat on crates near the waterline, doing nothing at all, apparently waiting for something, and no one shouted at them or demanded they work. And they were young, so impossibly, obscenely young. Boys with smooth faces and easy smiles. Boys who had never missed a meal. Boys whose bodies had not been carved lean by years of reduced rations and endless marching. Köhler looked at them and saw what German youth had looked like in 1939, before the war had consumed everything. A guard on the ship's deck noticed the German officer staring. He was perhaps 20 years old, with red hair and freckles and the relaxed posture of a man who had never been shelled. "First time seeing a real navy?" he asked in passable German, grinning. "Don't worry. This ain't even the big base. You should see what we got in the Pacific." Köhler said nothing. He could not speak. His mind was performing calculations it did not want to complete. Germany had been told. He had been told by officers and newspapers and the propaganda ministry itself that America was a nation of soft civilians, of gangsters and jazz musicians and Jews, incapable of true military sacrifice. They had been told that American manpower was limited, that the nation lacked the will to absorb heavy casualties, that a few sharp defeats would shatter their resolve. He had believed it. He had needed to believe it. Now he stood on a prison ship, watching an endless river of young, healthy, well-fed American men flow across the docks of just one naval base in just one city of a nation that stretched 3,000 miles beyond the horizon, and he understood that everything he had believed was a lie. What Köhler didn't know, what he would learn in fragments over the coming months in POW camps from Virginia to Kansas, was that Norfolk was not exceptional. It was ordinary. Ordinary for a nation that had mobilized 16 million men under arms while simultaneously running its factories, harvesting its fields, and building the largest naval fleet in human history. Ordinary for a nation that had so many young men, it could afford to station hundreds of thousands of them in bases where no combat would ever occur, training them for wars that might never need them. The Germans had wagered everything on the assumption that American manpower had limits. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong that assumption had been. To understand why German leadership believed America could be bled into stalemate, one must first understand what Germany had learned about war. By 1944, the Wehrmacht had been fighting continuously for 5 years. It had conquered Poland in 4 weeks, France in 6, and had driven to the gates of Moscow in 5 months. It had also spent 3 years grinding against the Soviet Union in a war of attrition that consumed men at rates unprecedented in human history. The Germans understood casualties. They understood what it meant to replace the irreplaceable, to fill divisions with old men and boys, to watch the quality of reinforcements decline month by month until experienced sergeants commanded platoons and lieutenants fresh from abbreviated officer courses led companies. They had paid for this knowledge in blood. Over 3 million German soldiers dead by the summer of 1944, another 2 million captured or missing. The Reich had mobilized every man it could find, scraped every factory and farm for bodies, lowered conscription ages, and raised them again, and still the Eastern Front devoured divisions faster than they could be rebuilt. From this experience emerged a conviction. All nations had limits. All manpower pools had bottoms. The war would be won by the side that reached its limits last. And Germany believed, with evidence that seemed irrefutable, that America's limits were closer than they appeared. Oberst Alexis von Röhne, chief of Fremde Heere West, had compiled detailed assessments of American military capacity throughout 1943 and 1944. His reports, circulated to senior commanders across the Wehrmacht, presented a picture of American strength that was simultaneously impressive and reassuring. The United States has mobilized approximately 11 million men under arms, von Röhne wrote in a March 1944 intelligence summary. Of these, approximately 3 million are committed to the Pacific Theater and will not be available for European operations. An additional 2 million are required for naval operations, coastal defense, and training establishments within the continental United States. This leaves approximately 6 million men theoretically available for the European theater. Von Röhne's mathematics continued with German precision. Of these 6 million, at least 2 million must be allocated to logistics, administration, and rear area security. Combat formations will therefore not exceed 4 million men. Given current deployment rates and the limitations of transatlantic shipping, we estimate that American ground combat strength in Europe will peak at approximately 2 million men by late 1944. Further expansion beyond this figure is logistically improbable. The assessment was thorough. It was professional. It was catastrophically wrong, not in its numbers, which were reasonably accurate, but in its assumptions about what those numbers meant. German planners believed that American casualties would function like German casualties, that each man lost would represent an irreplaceable subtraction from a finite pool. They believed that American society, soft and democratic and unaccustomed to sacrifice, would recoil from heavy losses. They believed that the political pressure of mounting casualties would force American leaders to negotiate, just as it had forced the French to negotiate in 1940, and nearly forced the British to negotiate before the Luftwaffe's defeat. General Major Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, articulated this view in a planning conference in February 1944. The Americans are not Russians. They will not absorb 300 casualties to take a single village. Their soldiers are volunteers and conscripts from a comfortable society. They fight for abstractions, not survival. If we can inflict sufficient casualties in the initial invasion period, public opinion will constrain their operations. The American mother will not tolerate what the Russian mother has tolerated. Heads nodded around the table. The logic seemed unassailable. What Warlimont and his colleagues failed to grasp was that American casualties and German casualties existed in entirely different mathematical universes. Germany in 1944 was a nation of approximately 80 million people, already fully mobilized, with every available man either in uniform or performing essential war work. There was no reserve. There was no slack. Every casualty represented a permanent diminution of national strength, a hole that could not be filled without creating another hole somewhere else. The United States in 1944 was a nation of 140 million people, of whom barely 12% were in uniform. The nation's factories were staffed, its farms were producing record harvests, its universities continued to graduate engineers and doctors and scientists. It had mobilized for war without mobilizing everything for war, a distinction that German planners, accustomed to total war, could not fully comprehend. More critically, American demographics bore no resemblance to German demographics. The United States had experienced a population boom in the 1920s, producing a generation of young men who came of military age precisely as the war demanded them. In 1944, there were approximately 11 million American men between the ages of 18 and 25, men in the prime years for military service. Germany, by contrast, had approximately 5 million men in the same age bracket, and most of them were already dead, wounded, or serving on fronts that could not spare them. But these statistics, however accurate, did not capture the true depth of the disparity. For that, one needed to see what German POWs would soon see, not numbers on a page, but an endless river of young men who seemed to materialize from nowhere, who replaced losses without apparent strain, who filled camps and bases and training facilities across a continent so vast that Germany could have fit inside it 15 times. Hauptfeldwebel Otto Bruckner, a veteran infantry NCO captured near Cherbourg in June 1944, had spent 22 years in the Wehrmacht. He had helped train the army that conquered France. He had survived Stalingrad, one of fewer than 6,000 Germans to escape that catastrophe. He believed he understood war better than any American could. His understanding shattered during the train journey from the coast to his first POW camp in Kansas. 3 days on that train, Bruckner recalled in a 1962 interview. 3 days across a country that never ended. I watched out the window. Farms, cities, factories, more farms, more cities, and everywhere, men. Men in uniform, men in work clothes, men driving trucks and operating machinery. Young men. I started counting the young men I saw at each station. I stopped counting after the first day. There were too many, more than I could process. He paused, the interviewer noted, and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. At Stalingrad, I watched the Red Army throw bodies at our positions until the bodies piled high enough to climb over. I thought I understood what unlimited manpower meant. I was wrong. The Russians had numbers, yes, but you could see the strain. You could see that it cost them. The Americans... He shook his head. The Americans did not look strained. They looked like they had not yet begun. Like everything we had faced so far was just the surplus, the overflow, the men they could afford to send while keeping the real army in reserve. Bruckner finished his cigarette and crushed it carefully, saving the butt out of habit from years when tobacco was precious. That train ride told me the war was lost, not because I saw weapons or factories, I expected those, but because I saw faces, young, fed, healthy faces that stretched from one horizon to another. We were fighting a nation that could lose 1 million men and not notice, and we had already given everything we had. What Bruckner sensed, what thousands of German POWs would come to understand in the camps scattered across America's heartland, was a truth that no intelligence report had captured. The United States was not merely large, it was inexhaustible, and against an inexhaustible enemy, Germany's only hope had been a quick victory. That hope was already dead. The POWs simply hadn't realized it yet. On September 16, 1940, 14 months before Pearl Harbor, a 47-year-old Army colonel named Louis Blaine Hershey sat in a cramped office in Washington and contemplated a problem that had defeated every democracy in history. How do you build an army from a nation that doesn't want one? The United States in 1940 possessed a standing army of 269,000 men, smaller than Portugal's, smaller than Romania's, ranked 17th in the world. It had no tradition of peacetime conscription, no infrastructure for mass mobilization, and a population that overwhelmingly opposed involvement in another European war. Polls showed that over 80% of Americans wanted to stay out of the conflict. Congress had passed neutrality acts specifically designed to prevent the nation from being dragged into foreign wars. And yet Hershey, along with a small group of military planners who could read a map, understood that neutrality was an illusion. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would become a German lake. If Japan continued its expansion, the Pacific would become a Japanese sea. The United States would find itself isolated on a hostile planet, facing enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to conquer continents. The nation needed an army. More precisely, it needed the capacity to build an army, a system that could transform millions of civilians into soldiers, a machine that could be activated when the moment came. Hershey had been working on this problem in various capacities since 1936. He had studied the failures of the Civil War draft, which had produced riots and resentment. He had analyzed the hastily improvised conscription of 1917, which had worked but had been chaotic, inefficient, and nearly overwhelmed by the scale of the task. He had examined the systems used by European nations, France, Germany, Britain, and found them inadequate for American conditions. The European model assumes a small, densely populated nation with centralized authority, Hershey wrote in a planning memorandum dated August 1940. The United States is none of these things. We are vast, dispersed, and constitutionally suspicious of federal power. Any conscription system that ignores these realities will fail, not from lack of manpower, but from lack of legitimacy. The solution Hershey devised was elegant in its decentralization, the local board system. Rather than impose conscription from Washington, Hershey proposed to distribute authority across more than 6,000 local draft boards, each one staffed by unpaid civilian volunteers from the community itself. These boards would register men, evaluate claims for deferment, and determine who would serve, not faceless federal bureaucrats in distant offices, but neighbors, employers, and civic leaders who knew the men they were classifying. If the banker and the barber and the minister decide together that young John Smith must serve, Hershey explained to skeptical congressmen, John Smith will serve without resentment. He will serve because his community has asked him to serve. This is how you build an army in a democracy, not by compulsion from above, but by consensus from within. The Selective Training and Service Act passed Congress on September 14, 1940, by a margin of just one vote in the House. It was the first peacetime draft in American history. It was also, though no one fully grasped this at the time, the foundation of the largest military mobilization the world had ever seen. Hershey was promoted to brigadier general and placed in charge of the selective service system. He would hold this position for the next 30 years. The registration began on October 16, 1940, a date designated as R-Day in War Department planning documents. Across the nation, 16.4 million men between the ages of 21 and 36 reported to registration sites in schools, post offices, fire stations, and town halls. They filled out cards. They received serial numbers. They became, in the dry language of the system, registrants. The scale was unprecedented. In a single day, the United States had created a database of military-age manpower larger than the entire population of many nations. And this was only the beginning. Over the next 4 years, the Selective Service System would conduct 6 more registrations, ultimately enrolling over 49 million American men. It would process more than 10 million inductions. It would classify, defer, exempt, and reclassify with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Each man assigned a status, each status reviewed and updated as circumstances changed, the entire apparatus humming along with the mechanical efficiency of an assembly line. But registration was merely the first step. The registrants needed to become soldiers, and for that, America needed something it had never possessed, a training infrastructure capable of processing human beings by the million. Major General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, was given the task of building this infrastructure from almost nothing. McNair was a small, quiet man with round spectacles and a manner that suggested a mathematics professor more than a warrior. He had served in France in 1918 as an artillery officer and had spent the interwar years in the Army's educational system, teaching at the Command and General Staff College, studying how soldiers learned. He understood that training was not merely about imparting skills. It was about transformation, about taking a farm boy from Iowa or a clerk from Brooklyn and turning him into someone who could kill efficiently and survive the killing. "We are not training soldiers," McNair told his staff in January 1941. We are manufacturing them, and like any manufacturing process, we must standardize, systematize, and scale. The numbers McNair faced would have paralyzed a lesser man. The Army needed to grow from 269,000 to over 8 million, a 30-fold expansion. It needed to do so while simultaneously fighting a global war, while experienced officers and NCOS were being siphoned off to combat units, while equipment and facilities remained in chronic shortage. McNair's solution was the Army Training Program, a 17-week cycle that transformed raw civilians into basically trained infantrymen ready for unit assignment. The program was standardized down to the hour. Week 1, basic military courtesy and discipline. Week 3, rifle marksmanship. Week 7, squad tactics. Week 13, battalion-level exercises. Every training camp in America followed the same schedule, taught the same skills, produced the same product. I don't want artists, McNair said. I want reliable components. A replacement arriving at a division in Normandy must be able to slot into any rifle squad and perform his function immediately. The system that trained him in Georgia and the system that receives him in France must speak the same language. To house this manufacturing process, the Army built what amounted to instant cities. Camp Blanding in Florida expanded from a National Guard facility housing 5,000 men to a sprawling complex capable of processing 55,000 trainees simultaneously. Fort Benning in Georgia, already the Army's largest infantry installation, doubled in size, then doubled again. New camps materialized from empty land: Camp Hood in Texas, Camp Campbell in Kentucky, Camp Rucker in Alabama, each one a self-contained municipality with barracks, mess halls, hospitals, theaters, chapels, and ranges stretching to the horizon. By 1943, the Army Ground Forces operated over 100 major training installations across the continental United States. They processed an average of 200,000 new inductees every month. They turned them around in 17 weeks and shipped them to ports on both coasts, an endless conveyor belt of military capability flowing from the American heartland to every theater of the war. Captain Warren Fletcher, a training officer at Camp Wheeler in Georgia, described the experience in a letter to his wife dated March 1944. They arrive on Monday. Boys, really, most of them have never been more than 50 miles from home. They're soft, confused, frightened. Some of them have never held a rifle. Some of them have never been yelled at by anyone in their lives. By Friday of the first week, they're marching. By the end of the first month, they can shoot. By the end of the fourth month, they're soldiers. Not good soldiers, not yet. That comes later, in combat. But soldiers, competent, functional, ready. He paused in his letter, adding a postscript that captured something statistics could not. The strange thing is, there are always more of them. Every Monday, a new train arrives. Every Monday, 1,000 new boys step off onto the platform, blinking in the Georgia sun. And I think, where do they all come from? How can there possibly be this many? But there are. There always are. America is deep, Martha. Deeper than I ever understood. Not everyone believed the system would work. Secretary of War Henry Stimson privately worried that the training was too rushed, too standardized, that America was producing mass men who would collapse against the professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht. General George Marshall fretted about officer quality. The Army was promoting men to command who would have spent a decade as lieutenants in peacetime. Even McNair harbored doubts, confiding to his diary that the system was a gamble on American adaptability. But the gamble was necessary because the alternative was unthinkable. America could not wait to build a perfect army. It needed an army now, vast, imperfect, but present. An army that could absorb losses and keep fighting. An army that could be everywhere at once. An army that would overwhelm its enemies not through individual excellence, but through sheer inexhaustible mass. The manufacturing process began. The conveyor belt started to move. And the Germans, watching from across the Atlantic, had no conception of what was coming. The first products of America's mobilization machine met the Wehrmacht in February 1943 in a place called Kasserine Pass. They were slaughtered. The American Second Corps, deployed to Tunisia as part of Operation Torch, collided with General Feld Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in the Jebel Skard hills of western Tunisia. What followed was the worst American defeat of the European War, a rout so complete, so humiliating that it seemed to validate everything the Germans believed about American soldiers. In 3 days of fighting, the Americans lost over 6,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They lost 183 tanks, 194 half-tracks, and more than 200 artillery pieces. Entire battalions disintegrated under German pressure, officers abandoning their commands, enlisted men streaming rearward in panic. At one point, American soldiers fled so precipitously that German motorcycle troops captured supply dumps still stocked with hot food. Rommel himself was dismissive. The American soldier is poorly trained and has no combat experience, he wrote in his diary on February 20th. He is soft, dependent on material comforts, and lacks the will to fight when the situation becomes difficult. Given time and casualties, he may improve, but he will never match the German soldier who has been hardened by years of war. The assessment rippled through Wehrmacht intelligence channels with something approaching glee. Oberst von Rohen incorporated Kasserine into his evaluations with evident satisfaction. Initial contact with American ground forces confirms pre-war assessments. Despite material superiority, American units demonstrate poor tactical discipline, inadequate leadership, and fragile morale under pressure. The quantitative advantage the Americans possess is substantially offset by qualitative inferiority. German soldiers who had fought at Kasserine told stories that became legend in the Wehrmacht. Feldwebel Gerhard Müller of the 10th Panzer Division described capturing an American supply column that had been abandoned intact. They left everything, trucks full of ammunition, food, medical supplies, things we had not seen in months, cigarettes still burning in the ashtrays, coffee still warm in the pots. They heard our tanks coming and simply ran. We joked that the Americans were not soldiers but delivery men. They brought us supplies and then departed. Unteroffizier Hans Brenner recounted finding American dead who carried items that astonished the Germans: chocolate, chewing gum, photographs of girlfriends in silver frames. One man had a small radio, a personal radio, not military equipment. We could not understand this. What kind of army lets its soldiers carry radios? What kind of soldier thinks he will have time to listen to music? These were not warriors. These were children playing at war. The mockery was not confined to the enlisted ranks. Senior German officers openly questioned whether America could ever field an effective army, regardless of how many men it conscripted. General Major Friedrich von Broich, whose forces had helped deliver the Kasserine defeat, offered a clinical assessment to his staff. The Americans have men. They have machines. What they lack is Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. This cannot be manufactured in a factory or taught in 17 weeks. The German soldier knows he fights for survival. The American soldier fights because he has been told to fight. When the choice becomes death or surrender, the American will surrender. This is their weakness, and it is fatal. For a brief, bitter moment, the Germans appeared to be right. American commanders scrambled to explain the disaster. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps, was quietly relieved. His replacement, Lieutenant General George Patton, arriving to find an army in disarray. Patton's initial assessment, recorded in his diary, was scathing. Gruesome. The men are soft. The officers are worse. Half of them should be shot for cowardice. The other half should be shot for incompetence. British allies were no kinder. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, commanding all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, sent a message to Churchill that dripped with condescension. The American troops are quite untrained and lack battle experience. They are soft and unused to hardship. It will take time to bring them up to standard, if indeed they can be brought to standard at all. The American press, kept largely ignorant of the magnitude of the defeat by wartime censorship, nonetheless sensed that something had gone badly wrong. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who had become famous for his empathetic portraits of ordinary soldiers, wrote from Tunisia with unusual bitterness. "Our boys came here expecting war to be like the movies. They found out it isn't. Some of them are learning, some of them are dead, and some of them are running, and I don't know if they'll ever stop." Within the selective service system, within the training camps, within the War Department itself, difficult questions were being asked. Had the system moved too fast? Had the pressure to produce quantity compromised quality? Were 17 weeks enough to turn a civilian into a soldier? Or had America merely created millions of men in uniform who would collapse at the first shock of combat? Major General Leslie McNair, architect of the training program, faced the hardest scrutiny. His standardized system had produced the men who broke at Kasserine. His 17-week graduates had fled from Germans who had trained for years. In a brutally honest internal memorandum dated March 1943, McNair acknowledged the failure. Kasserine revealed deficiencies we cannot ignore. Our training emphasizes individual skills, but inadequately prepares soldiers for the chaos of combat. Our officers receive insufficient tactical education. Our units lack cohesion. We are producing components that do not yet function as machines. He paused in the memorandum, then added a line that would prove prophetic. However, I note that the men who fled Kasserine were not killed. They remain available for further training, further experience, further hardening. The German believes he has proven that Americans cannot fight. He may have proven only that Americans cannot fight yet. The German intelligence apparatus had indeed drawn conclusions from Kasserine, conclusions that felt irrefutable at the time. Major Victor Lange, an analyst at OKW headquarters, compiled a comprehensive assessment in April 1943 that circulated to senior commanders throughout the Wehrmacht. American forces demonstrate characteristic weaknesses that can be reliably exploited. First, dependence on material superiority. When equipment advantages are neutralized, American units lose confidence rapidly. Second, poor junior leadership. American officers lack initiative and defer to rigid plans that cannot adapt to battlefield conditions. Third, fragile morale. American soldiers fight effectively only when winning. Under pressure, cohesion breaks down. Lange's assessment concluded with a recommendation that would shape German planning for the next 2 years. The American manpower advantage, while significant, is offset by these qualitative deficiencies. German forces should seek to engage Americans in conditions that negate material superiority. Close terrain, night fighting, rapid counterattack. Under such conditions, German qualitative advantages will prove decisive. The American army is large but brittle. Apply sufficient pressure and it will crack. For the moment, the evidence supported this view. Kasserine was a data point. Other early engagements in Sicily and Italy would provide additional data points. American units that performed unevenly, that required British support, that advanced slowly against outnumbered German defenders. The Wehrmacht settled into a comfortable assessment. America had men, but men were not soldiers. America could produce quantity, but quantity was not quality. The system that processed 200,000 men per month was manufacturing defective products, and no amount of manufacturing could overcome defective design. They could not see what was happening inside the machine. They could not see the reorganizations, the replacement of failed commanders, the brutal after-action reviews that dissected every mistake at Kasserine and rebuilt doctrine around the lessons. They could not see Patton transforming Second Corps through sheer force of will, could not see the veterans of Tunisia becoming the instructors who would train the next wave, could not see the 17-week program being refined, extended, sharpened based on actual combat data. They could not see, because they did not want to see, that America's army was learning. And an army that could learn, that could absorb a defeat like Kasserine and return stronger, was far more dangerous than an army that had never been defeated at all. But that realization lay in the future. In the spring of 1943, German confidence was high, American morale was shaken, and the conveyor belt continued to run, processing men by the hundreds of thousands, shipping them overseas by the tens of thousands, feeding them into a war that had not yet revealed its true shape. The reckoning was coming. But first, it had to be earned. July 28, 1944. The village of Notre-Dame-de-Senilly, 16 kilometers south of the shattered town of Saint-Lô. Oberleutnant Erich Brandenberger had been fighting without sleep for 4 days. His company, what remained of it, held a line of hedgerows overlooking a sunken lane that the Americans needed to advance. 47 men, down from a full-strength complement of 180. They had 2 functioning MG-42s, a handful of Panzerfausts, and approximately 200 rounds of rifle ammunition per man. No armor support, no artillery, no reserves. The Americans had attacked 3 times that morning. 3 times, Brandenburger's machine guns had scythed into them as they crossed the open ground between hedgerows. 3 times, American bodies had piled in the lane and the orchards beyond. 3 times, the attack had faltered, broken, retreated. By Brandenburger's count, his company had killed or wounded at least 120 American soldiers since dawn. The lane below was carpeted with olive drab. Medics had stopped coming forward. The fire was too heavy, the bodies too numerous. The flies had begun to gather. "They cannot sustain this," Brandenburger told his senior NCO, Feldwebel Kurt Schreiber. "No unit can absorb these losses. They will withdraw, reorganize. We have perhaps 2 hours." Schreiber, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Kursk and the long retreat through Ukraine, said nothing. He was staring through a gap in the hedgerow at the American positions 400 meters distant. "Herr Oberleutnant," he said quietly, "look." Brandenburger raised his binoculars. Fresh troops were moving into the American line. Not remnants, not walking wounded, not the shattered survivors of the morning's attacks. Fresh troops. Their uniforms were clean. Their equipment was complete. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who had not yet been shot at. Trucks were unloading behind them. More men, more ammunition, more of everything. "That's impossible," Brandenburger heard himself say. "We destroyed their assault companies. The 4th attack began at 1340. This time, the Americans did something different. They did not advance in a line across the open ground. Instead, artillery began to fall on Brandenburger's position. Not the harassing fire of the morning, but a concentrated bombardment that shook the earth and filled the air with dirt and steel fragments. The barrage lasted 15 minutes. When it lifted, Brandenburger's company had been reduced to 31 men, 1 functioning machine gun, and a ringing silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. Then the infantry came. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, not the rigid frontal assault of the morning, but a coordinated envelopment that suggested someone had been watching, learning, adapting. Brandenburger's single MG-42 swung left, cut down the first squad, swung right, caught another squad in the flank. But there were too many of them. There were always too many of them. Private First Class James Tolliver of the 29th Infantry Division was in the 3rd wave. He was 19 years old, from a dairy farm outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He had been in France for exactly 11 days. He had trained at Camp Wheeler, the same camp where Captain Fletcher wrote letters to his wife about the endless trains of boys arriving each Monday. Tolliver had been on one of those trains 5 months earlier. Now, he was running across a Norman field toward a hedgerow that flickered with muzzle flashes, and men were falling around him, and he did not stop. He did not stop because his sergeant was running beside him. He did not stop because the man to his left went down, and the man to his right went down, and somehow he remained upright. He did not stop because he had been trained not to stop, because the 17 weeks at Camp Wheeler had burned into his muscles a set of reflexes that overrode the screaming terror in his mind. He reached the hedgerow. He threw a grenade over the top. He heard it explode. He climbed through a gap blasted by the artillery and found himself face to face with a German soldier, a boy, really, no older than himself, who was struggling to clear a jam in his rifle. Tolliver shot him twice in the chest. Then he moved to the next position, and the next, and the next. Oberleutnant Brandenburger was captured at 1423, pulled from a shell crater where he had been trying to organize a retreat that was no longer possible. His company, his 47 men of the morning, his 31 men of the afternoon, had been reduced to 8 prisoners and an unknown number of dead scattered across the hedgerow line. He was marched to the rear through a landscape that dismantled everything he believed. The lane behind the American positions was choked with vehicles, trucks loaded with ammunition, jeeps carrying officers who consulted maps with the casual demeanor of men on a staff exercise, half-tracks mounting quad.50 caliber machine guns, their barrels still hot from the suppressive fire that had pinned his men during the assault, and everywhere, moving in both directions, men carrying stretchers bearing American wounded, men carrying crates of rations and water cans, men sitting in truck beds, cleaning their rifles, smoking cigarettes, waiting to be moved forward, Men who looked rested and fed and entirely untroubled by the carnage that lay half a kilometer ahead. An American captain noticed Brandenburger staring. "You boys put up a good fight," the captain said in accented German. "Took us all morning to crack your line." "We killed many of your men," Brandenburger replied. He did not know why he said it. Perhaps he needed to believe it still mattered. The captain nodded without apparent emotion. "Yeah, we'll need to write some letters." He gestured at the columns of men and vehicles stretching down the road. "Good thing we brought extras." Brandenburger was loaded onto a truck with 11 other German prisoners. The truck drove south, away from the fighting. It drove for 3 hours through a river of American military power that never thinned, never diminished, never showed the slightest sign of the strain that Brandenburger knew it must be feeling. At one point, the truck stopped to allow a convoy to pass traveling in the opposite direction. Brandenburger counted the vehicles, trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, more trucks, more tanks. He counted for 20 minutes. The convoy was still passing when the truck started moving again. "Where do they come from?" whispered Gefreiter Helmut Baumann, a young rifleman who had been captured beside Brandenburger. His voice was barely audible, as if he were afraid the Americans might hear. "We killed so many. Where do they all come from?" Brandenburger did not answer. He could not answer. He was performing arithmetic in his head. The casualty figures from the morning, the fresh troops appearing in the afternoon, the endless columns on the road behind them, and the arithmetic would not balance. The numbers refused to add up to anything that made sense. A German company inflicting 120 casualties should have broken an American battalion, should have created a gap in the line, a pause for reorganization, a moment of weakness to exploit. Instead, the Americans had simply absorbed it. Absorbed the dead and the wounded and the shattered equipment as if they were raindrops falling into an ocean. And then they had attacked again, with fresh men, fresh ammunition, fresh everything. It was at this moment, bouncing in the back of a truck through an endless corridor of American power, that Oberleutnant Erich Brandenburger understood the war was lost. Not because Germany was losing battles. Germany had lost battles before and recovered. Not because the Wehrmacht was outnumbered. The Wehrmacht had always been outnumbered, and had won through skill and will and superior leadership. The war was lost because the enemy could not be diminished, because every German victory, every defensive stand, every successful counterattack removed a finite number from a supply that had no bottom, because Germany was fighting an enemy that could trade 10 casualties for 1 and consider it an acceptable exchange rate, and have men left over. "We are not fighting an army," Brandenburger murmured, more to himself than to Baumann. "Herr Oberleutnant, we are fighting a nation that has decided to bury us in its sons, and it has more sons than we have bullets." The truck drove on. The convoys continued to pass, and somewhere behind them, in the hedgerows where Brandenburger's company had died, American engineers were already clearing the lane for the next advance. The dead had been collected. The equipment had been salvaged. Fresh troops had moved into position. By dawn, it would be as if the battle had never happened, except for the letters that would be written, and the families that would grieve, and the small crosses that would eventually mark a military cemetery in a country most of the dead had never heard of before they were sent to die in it. The machine did not pause. The machine did not mourn. The machine simply produced more. The first German POWs arrived in the United States in the summer of 1943, a trickle of Afrika Korps veterans shipped across the Atlantic after the Tunisian surrender. By the autumn of 1944, the trickle had become a flood. Over 30,000 prisoners per month crossing the ocean, processed through reception centers, distributed to more than 500 camps scattered across 45 states. They came expecting something. Propaganda had prepared them for a nation of decadence and weakness, of gangsters and race mixing and moral decay. They came prepared to maintain their dignity, to remain soldiers, even in captivity, to wait for the Reich's inevitable victory. What they found instead was a revelation that broke men more completely than combat ever had. Hauptmann Rudolf Köhler, the same Köhler who had seen Norfolk Naval Base from the deck of a prison ship, was processed through Camp Shanks in New York before being transported by train to Camp Concordia in Kansas. The journey took 4 days. It covered nearly 2,000 miles, and it systematically dismantled everything Köhler believed about America. His account, recorded in a 1958 memoir, remains one of the most detailed German testimonies of the psychological impact of American abundance. The train passed through cities I had never heard of, places with strange names like Altoona and Columbus and Kansas City. Each one was larger than I expected. Each one was undamaged. No bomb craters, no rubble, no buildings with their facades torn away. I had become so accustomed to destruction that I had forgotten what an intact city looked like. But it was not the cities that shattered Köhler's understanding. It was the spaces between them. Fields, endless fields of wheat and corn stretching to every horizon, and tractors. I counted the tractors, out of habit, the way I had counted enemy tanks. Hundreds of tractors, thousands perhaps, each one operated by a single man. In Germany, we had women and prisoners and old men harvesting by hand because we could not spare the fuel for machines. Here, one American farmer sat in an air-conditioned cab and harvested more grain in an afternoon than a German village could harvest in a week. The train stopped in small towns to take on water and fuel. At each stop, Köhler observed the Americans who gathered to watch the prisoners. They came to look at us as if we were animals in a zoo, old women, children, young girls who giggled and pointed, and young men, always young men, standing in groups, wearing civilian clothes, clearly not yet in uniform. I asked myself, why are these men not soldiers? Why are they standing on a railway platform in Kansas instead of fighting in France? A guard, noticing Köhler's attention, provided an answer he had not requested. Those boys? They'll get called up eventually. Got a whole list of 'em waiting. But hell, we got so many already. We can afford to let some finish high school first. Köhler recorded his reaction. I did not understand these words at first. My English was poor, and I thought I had misheard. Finish high school. We were conscripting 15-year-olds and sending them to die in Russia. The Americans were letting their young men finish high school before they called them, as if there was no urgency, as if they had all the time in the world, as if they had already won and were simply completing the formalities. Camp Concordia sat in the wheat fields of north-central Kansas, 1,500 miles from the nearest ocean, 5,000 miles from the war. It held approximately 4,000 German prisoners at its peak, a small city of barracks and mess halls and recreation facilities surrounded by watchtowers that seemed almost perfunctory. The guards were older men mostly, veterans of the First War, or men with minor disabilities that disqualified them from combat, or simply men who had drawn this assignment by the lottery of military bureaucracy. They were not cruel, they were not even particularly vigilant. They were, Köhler observed, profoundly bored. They did not guard us as if we were dangerous, he wrote. They guarded us as if we were an inconvenience, a chore to be completed before they could return to their real lives. I had been guarded by Russians who hated me, by British who despised me. The Americans did not hate or despise us. They were simply indifferent. We were not worth strong emotion. We were not worth the energy. The camp itself provided the next layer of psychological demolition. The barracks were wooden, simple, functional, but clean and heated and equipped with actual beds. The mess hall served food 3 times per day, bread and meat and vegetables, and on Sundays, dessert. The portions were larger than German military rations. They were larger, several prisoners noted with quiet horror, than German civilian rations. Feldwebel Werner Ostermann, captured near Aachen in October 1944, described his first meal at Camp Hearn in Texas. They gave us a tray. On the tray was a piece of meat. I do not know what cut, but it was large, perhaps 200 grams. Beside it, potatoes, green beans, a roll with butter, a glass of milk, and a piece of cake. He paused in his account, the interviewer noted, and his voice changed. I sat down and I looked at this tray and I began to weep. I could not stop myself. The man beside me asked what was wrong, and I could not explain. How could I explain that I was weeping because the Americans had given me more food for one meal than my family in Hamburg had seen in a week? How could I explain that I had been fighting for 4 years to defend a nation that could not feed its children against a nation that fed its prisoners cake? The abundance was not limited to food. Prisoners received clothing, new uniforms, or American work clothes marked with PW for identification. They received medical care from American doctors using American equipment and American medicines. They received recreational facilities, sports fields, libraries stocked with German-language books, even musical instruments for those who could play. Oberleutnant Manfred Richter, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Belgium, was transferred to a camp in Arizona that featured a swimming pool. A swimming pool, Richter repeated in a 1967 interview, as if still unable to believe his own memory. For prisoners, in the desert. The Americans had built a swimming pool for German prisoners of war. I swam in it every day for 3 months. I floated on my back and stared at the sky I had once flown through, and I tried to understand what kind of nation builds swimming pools for its enemies. He could not understand it. None of them could. But slowly, through observation and conversation and the accumulation of small details, a picture began to form. A picture of a nation so wealthy, so vast, so excessive in its capacity that it could afford gestures of humanity that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The guards talked freely, with the carelessness of men who had nothing to hide. "You know what I did before the war?" One guard at Camp Concordia asked Köhler. "I sold insurance, life insurance, had a nice house in Topeka, 2 kids, a Ford in the garage. When they called me up, my wife just got a job at the aircraft plant, makes more money than I ever did. Kids are fine, house is fine, war ends, I go back to selling insurance. No big deal, no big deal." The words echoed in Köhler's mind for weeks. In Germany, the war was total. Every resource, every person, every moment of every day was bent toward the war effort. Civilians starved, cities burned, children dug tank traps while their fathers died in Russia. In America, the war was, what? An interruption, an inconvenience, something to be handled while life continued, while farmers harvested wheat and factories produced consumer goods and young men finished high school before being called to fight. The mathematics became inescapable. Germany had mobilized everything it had, approximately 18 million men under arms at peak strength, drawn from a population of 80 million, representing nearly every able-bodied male between 16 and 60. The nation was exhausted, scraped clean, running on fumes and fanaticism. America had mobilized 16 million from a population of 140 million, representing barely half of its available manpower. The Selective Service System maintained lists of millions more men who had registered but not yet been called. The training camps continued to process 200,000 inductees per month. The pipeline was not merely full, it was overflowing. Lieutenant Johann Hauser, an infantry officer captured in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, crystallized the realization in a diary entry dated February 1945. "We launched our offensive with everything we had left, our last reserves, our final hope. We achieved surprise, made gains, killed many Americans. For 10 days, we believed we might turn the tide. Then their reinforcements arrived, division after division, men and tanks and artillery appearing as if conjured from the air. They did not just stop our offensive, they erased it. Within a month, they had taken back everything we had gained and were advancing into the Reich itself. I understand now what we were truly fighting. We were fighting a nation that could absorb our best blow, our final desperate strike, and respond by sending more men than we had bullets to kill them. We were fighting infinity, and you cannot defeat infinity. You can only delay it." The POW camps filled. 100,000 Germans by the end of 1944, 200,000 by February 1945, 375,000 by the war's end. Each new arrival brought fresh reports of American strength that seemed designed to break the spirit of those who heard them. "The new prisoners say there are more Americans now than in June," Köhler wrote in May 1945. "More tanks, more planes, more everything. 6 million American soldiers in Europe, they say. And still the camps in America train more. Still the ships cross the Atlantic. Still the machine produces." He set down his pen and stared at the Kansas wheat fields beyond the wire. "We lost this war in 1941, when we chose to fight a nation that could not be exhausted. We simply did not know it yet. It took 4 years and 10 million dead for us to learn what we should have known from the beginning. Germany could not defeat geography. We could not defeat arithmetic. We could not defeat a nation that stretched beyond the horizon and still had more. The guards at Camp Concordia went about their duties with the same bored indifference they had shown since Köhler's arrival. Somewhere, a radio played American music. Young men in civilian clothes walked the streets of nearby towns, waiting for a draft notice that might never come. The war in Europe had 6 days left. The machine was still running. The final statistics read like a verdict rendered by mathematics itself. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the United States military processed 16,112,566 men and women into uniform. 16 million. More than the entire population of Australia. More than the combined populations of Norway, Denmark, and Finland. More than the total number of soldiers Germany would field across the entire war on all fronts combined. The selective service system registered 49,232,611 American men, every male between the ages of 18 and 45. Of these, 10,110,104 were inducted through the draft. Another 6 million volunteered before they could be called. The remainder were classified, deferred, exempted, or held in reserve. A pool of millions who never wore a uniform because they were never needed. Never needed. The words bear repetition. America won a two-front global war and still had manpower left over. The training infrastructure processed this human flood with mechanical efficiency. The Army Ground Forces alone graduated 8,300,000 soldiers from its training programs, an average of 200,000 per month for 41 consecutive months. The Army Air Forces trained 193,440 pilots, 124,000 navigators, 309,000 gunners. The Navy trained 1,600,000 sailors. The Marine Corps, which began the war with 66,000 men, ended it with 485,000. The pipeline never faltered. The pipeline never slowed. In December 1944, the month of the Ardennes Offensive, Germany's last desperate gamble, American training camps inducted 283,000 new men. While German teenagers died in the snow of the Bulge, American teenagers were learning to march in the sunshine of Georgia and Texas, preparing for a war that would be over before many of them finished basic training. Casualty replacement, the metric that Germany believed would break America, functioned with an efficiency that bordered on the surreal. The U.S. Army in Europe suffered 586,628 battle casualties between D-Day and VE Day, 135,576 killed, 451,052 wounded. These were not trivial numbers. These were sons and brothers and husbands who would not come home, or who would come home broken. The cost was real. The grief was real. But the machine absorbed it. For every man killed, 8 arrived from the replacement pipeline. For every man wounded, 3 returned to duty after recovery, while 2 more arrived from training. The army that landed at Normandy, with 73 divisions, ended the war with 89 divisions in Europe, larger after 11 months of continuous combat than when it had begun. Germany, by contrast, experienced the arithmetic of national extinction. The Wehrmacht suffered approximately 1,800,000 dead on the Western Front alone between June 1944 and May 1945. It lost another 2 million captured. The divisions that had defended Normandy, proud formations with histories stretching back to the Kaiser's army, were destroyed, rebuilt with old men and children, destroyed again, and finally dissolved. By April 1945, German divisions existed primarily on paper, their actual strength often less than a single American battalion. The numbers revealed what the POWs had sensed in their bones. Germany had been fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could not be attrited. For every German soldier who killed an American, 4 more Americans arrived to take his place. For every American division that bled white in combat, another division completed training and shipped overseas. For every desperate German offensive that achieved local success, American reserves materialized to seal the breach, counterattack, and advance. The math was not close. The math was not even competitive. The math was an execution. Slow, methodical, and utterly without hope. The men who had planned Germany's war, who had dismissed American manpower, who had calculated that democratic softness would constrain American sacrifice, were forced to confront their miscalculation in interrogation rooms and prison cells across Europe. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, was interrogated at length following Germany's surrender. The transcripts reveal a man grappling with a strategic error that had cost millions of lives. "We believed the Americans would reach a culminating point," Jodl told his interrogators. "Every army reaches a culminating point, a moment when offensive capability is exhausted and the force must pause to recover. We planned our entire defensive strategy around forcing the Americans to this point." He paused, the transcript notes, and removed his monocle to polish it. "The Americans never reached it. We kept waiting for the pause, the hesitation, the moment when their losses would force them to consolidate. It never came. They absorbed casualties that would have crippled any European army and continued to advance. They replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. We were not fighting an army that could be exhausted. We were fighting a phenomenon, a force of nature. There is no doctrine for defeating a force of nature." General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, titular head of the Wehrmacht High Command, offered an even starker assessment before his execution at Nuremberg. The fundamental error was believing that America was a nation like other nations, that it had limits like other nations, that it would behave like other nations when those limits were reached. America is not a nation. It is a continent that decided to become a nation. We were fighting against geography itself, against arithmetic itself, against a scale of resources and manpower that European experience could not comprehend. We should have known this. We chose not to know it, and so we are here. But perhaps the most devastating admissions came not from generals in interrogation rooms, but from ordinary soldiers reflecting on their experience years after the war's end. Hauptmann Rudolf Köhler, who had watched Norfolk from the deck of a prison ship, who had crossed Kansas on a train through wheat fields that never ended, returned to Germany in 1946 and spent 30 years as a municipal administrator in Bavaria. In 1978, he was interviewed by a German television documentary about the POW experience. His testimony, delivered in the measured tones of a man who had spent decades processing what he had witnessed, captured something that statistics alone could not convey. "They asked me once, the Americans at the camp, what I thought of their country. I told them I thought it was very large. They laughed. They thought I was making a small joke. I was not joking." He leaned forward, the camera recording every line on his aged face. "You must understand what large meant to us. Germany is a small country. We knew every kilometer of it. We had measured our strength against our neighbors and found ourselves superior. We believed size was a disadvantage, that large nations were slow and clumsy, that small nations with superior will and organization could defeat them. This is what our history taught us. This is what our victories proved. Then I rode a train for 4 days across America, and I understood that we had been measuring with the wrong instruments. Size, at a certain point, becomes something else. It becomes inevitability. A nation that can lose 100,000 men and shrug, not because it does not care, but because it has so many more, cannot be defeated by a nation that must count every soldier. We were playing chess. They were playing, I do not know the word, a game where the board itself is infinite and the pieces regenerate faster than you can capture them." Köhler was silent for a moment before delivering his final assessment. "Every German soldier I knew believed we were the best, better trained, better led, better motivated, and perhaps we were. Perhaps man for man, we were superior. But the Americans did not fight man for man. They fought nation for nation, and in that contest, we were children challenging the ocean. We did not lose because we were weak. We lost because they were endless." Feldwebel Werner Ostermann, who had wept over a dinner tray in Texas, attended a reunion of former POWs in Hamburg in 1985. His remarks to the gathering were recorded by an attendee. "I have been asked many times what defeated Germany. The generals say it was strategic errors. The historians say it was industrial capacity. The politicians say it was Allied unity. These things are all true, but I will tell you what defeated Germany from the perspective of a man who held a rifle." He held up his hands, weathered by 40 years of post-war labor. What defeated Germany was the American replacement, the man you killed in the morning who was replaced by another man in the afternoon, the company you destroyed that was rebuilt overnight, the division you shattered that reappeared the next week as if nothing had happened. You could kill them and kill them and kill them, and there were always more. They came from places we had never heard of: Kansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, places that were just names on a map, places that turned out to contain more young men than all of Germany. He lowered his hands and his voice dropped. We called them soft. We called them amateurs. We called them inferior. And then they buried us. Not because they were better soldiers, because there were more of them than we could kill. In the end, that is the only mathematics that matters in war, and we were on the wrong side of the equation from the very beginning. The POW camps in America closed in 1946. The last prisoners were repatriated to a Germany divided and destroyed, a nation that had gambled everything on the assumption that willpower could overcome arithmetic. It could not. The conveyor belt had won. The pipeline had won. The system that processed boys from dairy farms and insurance offices and high school classrooms had won, not through brilliance, not through superior tactics, but through the simple, inexorable logic of mass. Germany had tried to kill its way to victory. America had simply produced more than Germany could kill. On a September afternoon in 1944, Hauptmann Rudolf Köhler had stood at the railing of a prison ship and watched the coast of Virginia emerge from the Atlantic haze. He had seen Norfolk Naval Base, the ships, the cranes, the welding torches, and felt something shift inside him. But it was not the ships that broke him. It was the men, the endless, impossible, inexhaustible river of young American men flowing across the docks with the casual confidence of a nation that had never known scarcity. He had been told that America was soft, that its people lacked the will for sacrifice, that its army was large but brittle, a paper force that would crumble under the pressure of German steel and German discipline. He had believed it. He had needed to believe it, because the alternative, that Germany was fighting an enemy it could not diminish, could not exhaust, could not defeat through any application of skill or courage or will, was unthinkable. 30 years later, Köhler stood in a cemetery outside Munich. He came every year on the same date, November 11th, the anniversary of the first armistice, the day that was supposed to have ended all wars. He stood among the graves of men he had known: his brother, killed at Stalingrad, his company sergeant, killed at Cannes, his first commanding officer, killed in a bombing raid over Hamburg, Germans who had fought and died believing in a victory that was never possible. He thought about the train ride through Kansas, the wheat fields that stretched beyond sight, the young men standing on railway platforms in towns whose names he could not pronounce, waiting to be called to a war that had not yet needed them. He thought about the guard who had told him those boys could finish high school first, finish high school, as if the mightiest war in human history was merely an inconvenience to be scheduled around graduation. He thought about the swimming pool in Arizona, the cake served to prisoners, the bored indifference of American guards who treated their captives not as enemies, but as paperwork. And he thought about what all of it had meant, what it still meant. 3 decades later, as American soldiers stood on German soil protecting the nation they had conquered from the nation that had once been Germany's ally. We measured ourselves against France, Köhler murmured to the graves, against Britain, against Russia. We believed we could defeat any European power, and perhaps we could have. But America was not a European power. America was something else, something we had no framework to understand. He placed a small wreath at the base of a stone cross, one of thousands, rows of identical markers stretching across the manicured grass. We asked how many divisions America could field. We should have asked how many divisions America could lose. The answer would have told us everything. The answer would have told us that we were already dead, that we had been dead since the moment we chose to fight a nation that could bleed more than we could ever make it bleed. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the smell of autumn leaves and distant rain. Köhler stood in silence, an old man visiting old ghosts, carrying the weight of a truth that had taken him a lifetime to fully articulate. The war had taught many lessons. The historians would write about strategy and tactics, about industrial capacity and technological innovation, about the brilliance of commanders and the courage of soldiers. These lessons were real, and they mattered. But the deepest lesson, The lesson that Rudolf Köhler had learned on a train through Kansas and in a camp surrounded by wheat fields and in the faces of young Americans who did not yet know they were soldiers was simpler and more terrible. Nations do not win wars. Systems win wars. The nation that can feed its army wins. The nation that can replace its losses wins. The nation that can absorb punishment and keep producing, keep training, keep shipping men and machines to the front in numbers that overwhelm the enemy's capacity to destroy them. That nation wins. Always. Inevitably. Mathematically. Germany had built the finest army in Europe. It had trained the most skilled soldiers, designed the most lethal weapons, developed the most sophisticated tactics. Man for man, unit for unit, it was superior to anything its enemies could field. And none of it mattered. None of it mattered because America had looked at war and seen not a contest of champions, but a problem of production, a logistical challenge, an industrial process that happened to involve killing. The nation that had built Ford and General Motors and U.S. Steel applied the same principles to warfare. Standardize, mass-produce, replace, repeat. Treat soldiers not as irreplaceable craftsmen, but as components in a system. Treat losses not as tragedies, but as acceptable wastage rates. Treat victory not as a matter of brilliance, but as a matter of throughput. The Germans had tried to win with quality. The Americans had won with quantity, but a quantity so vast, so inexhaustible, so systematically organized that it transcended mere numbers and became something closer to a force of nature. Köhler had used that phrase in his television interview, a force of nature. He had meant it literally. You could not negotiate with a flood. You could not outmaneuver an earthquake. You could not defeat a tide through superior tactics. You could only endure it or be swept away. Germany had been swept away. In the decades that followed, American military planners would study the lessons of the war and codify them into doctrine. They would build systems upon systems, logistics networks that spanned continents, training pipelines that could scale to any demand, reserve structures that could mobilize millions within weeks. They would fight new wars in new places, and sometimes they would struggle, and sometimes they would fail. But they would never again face an enemy that doubted their capacity to sustain a long war. The lesson of 1944 had been taught too thoroughly for that. The United States had discovered something about itself in the crucible of global war, that its true strength lay not in the courage of its soldiers, though that courage was real, not in the genius of its generals, though genius existed, not in the quality of its weapons, though the weapons improved with each passing year. Its true strength lay in its depth, in the vast, quiet, almost incomprehensible reserves of manpower and material and will that could be summoned when the nation decided to summon them. The POWs had seen this depth. They had ridden trains through it, eaten food produced by it, watched young men emerge from it in numbers that defied European comprehension. They had returned to Germany carrying a truth that their countrymen did not want to hear, that the war had been lost before it began, that Germany had challenged an opponent whose resources were essentially infinite, that all the blood and sacrifice and heroism had been spent against an enemy who could simply wait them out. Hauptmann Rudolf Köhler died in Munich in 1991 at the age of 81. His obituary mentioned his military service only briefly, a few lines about campaigns in France and Russia, a note about his years as a prisoner of war. It did not mention Norfolk Naval Base. It did not mention the train through Kansas. It did not mention the moment when a young German officer had watched an endless river of American sailors and understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that everything he had been told about his enemy was a lie. But his children knew, his grandchildren knew. They had heard the stories, the wheat fields, the swimming pools, the cake served to prisoners, the boys who could finish high school before being sent to war. They had learned, through an old man's memories, what it meant to fight a nation that could not be exhausted. On the afternoon of September 19th, 1944, Rudolf Köhler had seen Norfolk and asked himself, where do they all come from? The answer, he eventually understood, was everywhere. They came from Kansas and California and Tennessee, from farms and factories and high schools, from cities with strange names and towns too small to appear on German maps. They came from a nation that stretched 3,000 miles and contained multitudes, multitudes that had not yet been called, multitudes that were still being born, multitudes that would keep coming long after every German soldier lay dead or captured or defeated. The Germans had mocked American softness. They had laughed at American inexperience. They had counted American casualties and calculated American breaking points and waited for American will to falter. They had not understood that they were counting grains of sand on a beach that stretched beyond the horizon. They had not understood that the beach did not end. And by the time they understood, it was already too late. The tide had come in. The flood had risen. The force of nature had swept across Europe with 16 million faces, each one replaceable, each one part of a system that did not mourn, did not hesitate, did not stop. The Germans had tried to fight an army. They had been drowned by a nation.